Hey, Betsy. Hi. Oh, recording in progress.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaylee Perret Shaughnessy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Whittier Birthplace. Thank you for joining us tonight for our virtual lecture series. We are excited to have Emily Esser. She is an art historian who studies Deacon Robert Peckham. She is our speaker this month, and we are very excited to learn more about Peckham and his portrait of John Greenleaf Whittier and others. So Emily, take it away.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you to all of you for coming. Some of you may already know about Peckham, some of you might not. It's likelier that you do know a little bit, but even if you do, if you're already familiar with him and his portraiture, this will be a really wonderful opportunity to introduce to you some more aspects of his historical significance, his abolitionist activity, the way that he wrote, the things that he said, which I think are quite uncommon for a painter like this. Um, for folk art painters, early American portraitists, often all we have is a name, maybe a little scrap of information about them, maybe a few works, maybe if we're lucky, more than one that's signed. But for Peckham, there's this wealth of information about him. Portraits, a group of 17 at the Forbush Memorial Library in Westminster, his hometown, and countless more. We know how many he painted. We have an impression from some documents written about his congregational church activity that there are a great many of them, and it's really exciting to know that there could be even more than we know. So if you got one at home, email me. But if you don't, here's a great opportunity to meet some more of them, especially his portrait of John Greenleaf Whittier, the abolitionist and poet, whom he famously rode in a wagon to visit Whittier, and also his brother, Samuel Howland Peckham, who worked on an anti-slavery committee alongside Whittier, which is probably how he met him. But I will show you all that in a minute. Here, in the meantime, is Westminster Village. It hangs at Forbush Memorial Library. You might have seen it if you visited. But on to the next slide. The Life and Times of Peckham. So here's a brief overview from Dale Johnson, the first author to write, published in an art history journal on him. There have been others before her. Anne Howard, notably a historian from Westminster, she had compiled some documents, including thorough documentation of his anti-slavery activities, which some of which I've drawn upon for this. But there he is. There's his self-portrait in the upper right-hand corner there. Nice looking guy. This was found in his home by the previous owners of his home. If you don't want me to name you, I won't, but you guys were great. So this is him. And then here is him in the lower left-hand corner again, and his wife, Ruth. Here's a brief overview. The radical abolitionist and temperance advocate, Deacon Robert Peckham, has been known as a primitive portraitist of above average capability in the 100 years since his death. Might sound a little harsh to call him primitive but above average, but that's actually pretty common in discussions of early American portraiture, called primitive, naive. As terminology has really settled on folk art because they really weren't primitive or naive. Many of them were quite accomplished people, and they moved in circles with other accomplished people like Peckham and Whittier. In the upper right-hand corner, far up there, it's his very first portrait. Then there's Whittier. Then there's his son, Samuel Henry, at the bottom, chronologically his last known portrait that I'm aware of. So moving back to the info here, notably, he was a deacon of the First Congregational Church. In issues of greater morality, temperance, and slavery, Peckham was both rigid and vocal. His house became headquarters for anti-slavery lecturers and a station for the Underground Railroad. Now, both of those have occasionally been treated as speculative in prior published research. However, I'm pleased to say it's absolutely factual. There are multiple accounts of a particular woman and her child that Peckham helped escape via the Underground Railroad, a former slave. Different accounts from different hands, different people, even a handwritten letter from Edward Kendall Jr. of Westminster, who saw it for himself and wrote her story down as she had told it to him, which is very exciting to be able to corroborate how Peckham helped these innocent people. So here is the Peckham Sawyer family. It's a group portrait from 1817. It's at the MFA Boston. I saw it in their back rooms. However, I'd love for them to put it on display. Feel free to write them a letter saying they should. If you don't want to, that's fine too. Here he is on the right, his brother-in-law, Joseph Sawyer, his wife, Ruth, in the middle, their children. As Carol Troyan wrote for the MFA Boston in 1980, it's a particularly complex scene. She speculates that he may have been inspired by prints of classical art in group portraits. And interestingly, there is indication that that is true. His art teacher, Ethan Allen Greenwood, sold him prints for his artistic purpose and reference and learning. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit about this one. So there he is in the context of his family in his home, recorded very lovingly all together, all the generations gathered. Now, here's a bit more about Peckham. He was a deacon by 1828. He expressed his radical views on temperance and abolition of slavery. Troyan goes on to write, best known are Peckham's stylized, severely outlined portraits of children, painted in bright colors and often including their favorite toys. Now, here are two very fine examples of his portraiture around 1830 to 40. It's a boy with a toy cat. Thank you to David Schorsch for the image. Here's Betsy Hale. I'm in a private collection. She is part of a group of three. My friends have her parent portraits, actually. It's a rare group of three. It's commonly groups of two, but she's just darling with her little book there. And the boy with his little cat. Peckham cared very deeply for children and the well-being of children. And for the entire community around him. He was very focused on that. He was very benevolent as a person, as well as being a talented painter who could really capture these very distinctive likenesses, both young and old and everything in between. Here are two child portraits, full length, that I've been fortunate enough to discover. They are quite recognizable compared to Peckham's other known works. As Deborah Chotner wrote, at any time, these children might be angelic or mischievous, but in each case, Peckham depicts them as specific individuals rather than types. And I think that that's one of the most defining trademarks of his work. They have such a strong sense of character. Obviously, you can spot them by a consistent, vivid sense of facial modeling and sculpting in the way he uses paint to illuminate the face in 3 dimensions, and then the world around them. The little whip, the prop for the child, the carpet, the little poodle dog, just charming, charming stuff. The boy is in a museum in Hawaii. His name is not known. The girl is Juliette G. Lord. She lived in Boston, Massachusetts from 1839 to 1926. That one's at the Berkeley Art Museum. So they've certainly traveled a far way from Massachusetts, but it's always a delight to discover more of them. So I thought I'd include those just so you get a little taste of his child portraiture as well as the adults, which we're going to spend more time discussing. Now, here's a bit more about Peckham. David Crashes wrote 2 articles about Peckham, the first in Maine Antique Digest, January 1985. I will give a little shout out to Maine Antique Digest here. They've just published my own article about Peckham. So thank you to all of you for that. It was a really delight to work together. Hope to write another, send it in for you. But David Crashes did that long before I did. So here's some of his findings. Robert Peckham had 9 children. I will interject, only some of them lived to adulthood, as was tragically common in that era. But he cared very deeply for his children. We'll be discussing that as well. He was medium-sized, rather stooped, and wore his hair long. He liked children. They frequently came to his house from the school across the road for a drink of water. Unlike most Peckham details, this one is largely anecdotal, but it certainly seems in character for him. He was known to have written poetry, although none has been preserved. This is one I've been fortunate enough to be able to disprove. I'm not sure how Crashes found out about his poetic inclinations. There are old newspaper articles that say, such as this one, the historical poem from the pen of the venerable Robert Peckham, aged 83 years, was read at the Westminster celebration. Now, this was a dedication for a Civil War memorial where Peckham's son, Samuel Henry, perished as a prisoner of war in Andersonville. The author of the article says, considering the age of the author, it's really a literary curiosity. Mr. Peckham is father of the Reverend Joseph Peckham, who delivered an address. So even at 83, he was still doing his best to contribute, to make himself heard, to write, to publish, to support Westminster. And that's a very consistent thread in all of the historical documents we found about his life. He believed in Westminster and the people of Westminster, even when political conflicts essentially forced him to move to Worcester temporarily. issues of abolition and whether abolitionist lecturers should be permitted in the church. He still came back to Westminster. He wanted to live there, to raise his family there. And it seems appropriate that it should be such a hub for his works now, today. So here's Whittier, as mentioned. Now, there's a big legend with Whittier that I haven't been able to entirely disprove, but I haven't really been able to prove it either, and that's actually quite a stumbling block for me. It is said that Whittier called his work eminently artless, allegedly. He said, "I was painted by Deacon Peckham of Westminster when he was on a visit to Haverhill." Notably, this was probably to visit his brother Samuel Howland Peckham, who served on the New England Anti-Slavery Convention in 1834. The two of them went together as the delegates from Haverhill, and they knew each other before that. So Samuel H. Peckham Howland probably secured this sitting for him. Anyway, it says, "I only recall sitting for him 2 or 3 times, but how it looked, I have no idea. It was a good picture, it was a miracle, for the deacon was eminently artless." Bit harsh, as you can see from the comparison. That is pretty much how Whittier looked. I mean, he's being a bit harsh there. And he was passing judgment without having seen the portrait. But fortunately, there is a postscript to this that I think is more interesting than the eminently artless story. Supposedly, eminently artless came from a letter. 2 different sources cite 2 different letters to 2 different people in 2 different years, contacted the Harvard Library that has them. The librarian could not find either of them, but was incredibly helpful and turned up a different piece of evidence from Whittier's biographer, which has a typed page of notes about Peckham, and then below that, a mention of the eminently artless. But this says, "He never saw the sketch that had been made of him until near the close of his life, when Mr. Alfred S. Rowe of Worcester sent him a photograph of it. In his acknowledgement, he said, 'It is the face of a stranger, but I doubt not it is a likeness of the young Whittier. It represents a fresh-faced young man with black hair and a little stiff in attitude and garb.'" Now, this is right from Samuel Picard, who is his biographer. These are in the official Whittier papers. So I think it's very fair to say that this is accurate. This is what he said. But I wasn't entirely satisfied with that. Of course, it's nice to have that, but it's more or less hearsay. So I thought I could dig a little deeper. And there is plentiful evidence that indicates the portrait is at the Worcester Society of Antiquity, as this indicates. It says, "Is now in the possession of the Worcester Society of Antiquity." And we mentioned Mr. Alfred S. Rowe of Worcester. Guess what? He was in the Worcester Society of Antiquity. He may even have been partly responsible for the acquisition of it. What we do know is he took a photo of it and he sent it to Whittier. Now, can we actually prove that? A 1950 compendium on Whittier says, among the listed representations of him, 1889 Amesbury photograph of the Deacon Peckham portrait, 1835, which is an error. Now at American Antiquarian Society, Whittier has endorsed on the back from an oil painting by Deacon Peckham at the age of 23. That's significant. That could actually be legitimate proof. And guess what? It exists. It was found, thank you to Breon Barrett at the American Antiquarian Society for digging it up in their 5,000 portrait files. This is it. This is the actual photograph that was sent. And it has writing on the back. John G. Whittier, age 26, from a portrait made by Robert Peckham, 1833, from A.S. Rowe. That's Alfred S. Rowe. Acknowledged January 19th, 1888. Now, this is really actually quite huge. I mean, this is definitive, decisive proof that the incident described by Picard happened. He said it, and he said favorable things about it. Not so eminently artless after all. Apparently, Whittier reassessed his decision to speak so critically of Peckham. So I think it's really nice to know after all this time, and after all the times that eminently artless appears in publications about Peckham, I think it's nice to have something to disprove that. So Whittier just wasn't actually all that harsh in the end after all. Maybe Peckham would have been satisfied to hear that he liked it. I'd like to think so. We don't know exactly what Peckham did with it. The documentation mentions he was persuaded to sit for a portrait which the artist might take away with him. Now, I don't know exactly what he intended to do with it, but it probably was destined for the Westminster Academy, is my best supposition. He was very invested in the local events of Westminster and promoting the church, promoting education. Here are 2 little children with books Webster Tucker Private Collection, and Miss Eaton at the Fruitlands Museum. They obviously, we don't know if they went to Westminster Academy, but little representation there of the kinds of children that might have attended. The National Register of Historic Places noted in 1829, Westminster Academy was founded by supporters of Cyrus Mann, the first Congregational minister. We'll be hearing more about him. He was fairly significant. He worked together very closely with Peckham in a great number of things. It says, Westminster Academy educated both male and female students from town and surrounding communities. It's quite significant because we can find Peckham's own children, boy and girls, in these records. There they are. Aren't they adorable? Here is George Peckham. Here's Ruth Peckham. And here's Mary M. Peckham and an unknown baby. We don't know who the baby is, just painted in the portrait. But that's Mary, his youngest daughter, and then Ruth and George, his older children. And you can see all of them appear here in these records from the Westminster Academy. It's really nice to be able to see them in there, just for definitive proof. I mean, we can assume they went to the school that he had helped to found and assisted in promoting, but it's nice to see it there. And there is his 1850 census. We see him as portrait painter. We see George as Tin Man. We see Henry, who's Samuel Henry, went by Henry, as a painter. Mary M., his little daughter, and then his second wife, Mahalath, who he married after his first wife, Ruth, tragically passed away. We'll also be discussing that because I've located an obituary for Ruth that almost certainly was written by Peckham, and it's really quite beautifully written. He was a remarkably good writer. So here's a little bit about his teacher, Ethan Allen Greenwood. Here's the note that Greenwood sold him prints. It's from A New Nation of Goods by David Jaffe. And he dug through some of Greenwood's very detailed diaries. I've actually scanned them myself, but they are quite illegible. So I'm working on that one. I will report back later, but I did find in there Bob Peckham in his journal. So that's all quite funny. I think that's the only time I've seen him called Bob Peckham. But he appears in there recurringly as Greenwood notes his artistic progress and improvement. And here we can see that their styles actually are not too dissimilar at this time. James Humphreys, his friend in 1809, we know it's his friend. He wrote on the back that it was to my great friend, James Humphreys, or similar. And then here's The Lady by Greenwood. She was painted 1807 or 1809, indecipherable writing, but this coincides pretty well when Peckham was learning to paint. And I think you can really see the likeness between them. Stylistically. Of course, he evolved as time went on. He learned to develop his own style, more refined, a little more academic, but not fully. I would not characterize him as truly academic because he didn't really adhere to the trends of academic art that were, I think, sometimes can be a little fuzzy, a little cloudy, idealizing. And he was very precise, very crisp. It's what characterizes his work. And a little bit more about Greenwood and Westminster, thanks to Nick Langhart from Forbush Library for pointing out which of the homes in that Westminster painting is Greenwood's. Is that big red one? There he is, he painted himself. He taught noticeably in Westminster. It comes up in his diaries. This was before Westminster Academy, came here as a teacher. He learned law in Westminster. So Greenwood was a very accomplished guy, a lot of professions, more than most people. Here's more about him teaching. Notably, he presented books to the Female Westminster Social Library Company in 1809. Remember that thing about the females of Westminster, that will come back. Here's his home in Westminster's history. An important little side note, for 2 or 3 years, around 1824, the house of Deacon Peckham was gratuitously warmed and lighted for the purpose of holding the meetings of the church. Now, you have to wonder why would they say it gratuitously warmed and lighted? We kind of take that for granted, right? You know, heat, light, coming. Not so much. The church did not have indoor heating until 1827. It was 92 years before they had ever conceived that a fire could be had in the Church of God, as A. Judson Rich writes in the 125th historical discourse on the founding of the Congregational Church. I usually call it the 125th because its title is extremely long, very unwieldy. So the 125th, Judson Rich wrote about this, their lack of heat. It was actually controversial when they introduced the stove. So Peckham was actually ahead of his time by heating his house for church meetings. It's kind of extraordinary to think about. But there it is. And there's a little plaque, Deacon Peckham House. Now, here's more of Peckham supporting Westminster, doing the best he could. As early as 1824, at a social prayer meeting at Deacon Peckham's house, originated the idea of building a vestry. At the close of the meeting, Deacon Peckham proposed that a vestry be built. The proposition was favorably received, and it was decided by unanimous vote to undertake the enterprise, and $400 was subscribed on the spot. Deacon Peckham heading the paper with $20, and others following with more or less. A building committee was chosen, of which, surprise, Deacon Peckham was chairman. So he really got things done. You review these documents, it becomes more and more clear exactly how proactive and organized he was. It's impressive, But it was delayed. The building was not completed till 1829. Mr. Mann was the leading spirit in the enterprise. He proposed that the two objects of a vestry and academy might be combined. And so they did. The upper story was for the school, the lower room was for the church. This went on pretty well until 1846, when the anti-slavery lecturers began to be a controversial subject. And so the Academy filed for reincorporation with none other than Peckham's name on it, and Benjamin Wyman, who he worked closely with in some matters in Westminster. Now, the Westminster Academy got a pretty rave review here in the 125th. They're quoting the Congregational Quarterly. If Mr. Mann had never done anything else, he would deserve the gratitude of Westminster. A good many were fitting for Amherst and Dartmouth colleges. There is an Amherst and Peckham connection. Again, it's what I wrote for Maine Antique Digest about. You should check that out. Now, more about Cyrus Mann. He was more of a facilitator, while Peckham was more proactive and really took a stance. Cyrus Mann sort of hung back a little. As George Goodyear, an abolitionist, writes, he was a member of a society formed on the principles of immediate emancipation. Now, this is quite important because immediate emancipation was more of a radical stance. Others took more of a soft pedaling approach, kind of phasing it out, go easy on the South. But here, Peckham and the other members of the society felt very strongly, this is wrong, this should be done, we should get rid of this. He took a very firm stance, as we can see, as did Cyrus Mann, who had not preached on emancipation yet, but thinks he shall soon. Now, here's more. These are anonymous portrait subjects by Peckham. We don't know their names, we don't know where they're from, which I think can be quite sad to realize. We have all these lovely images of all these people and their names have been lost. It's very rare to be able to return a name to a portrait. Sometimes it can be done for these, it probably won't yet, but he painted primarily in Westminster and surrounding towns. And he chose subjects, Whittier comes to mind, that shared his values and that he got along with. So it's entirely likely that these could have been Westminster people. We don't know, but it's fun to speculate. So here is what Judson Rich writes. It was through the efforts of Deacon Peckham that a Mr. Goodyear, the very same from that letter, was introduced to this place to lecture on the cause of the oppressed. He lectured all day and evening, carrying with him the sympathy of the whole congregation. With a very few exceptions, a society was soon formed as the result, as was done in most of the surrounding towns within a few months from that time. Deacon Peckham's house was the headquarters for these lecturers, where they found a welcome, often a week at a time. Now, he was the headquarters. I mean, I think that's really tremendous to see this in print. And this was published when he was still alive. He was very old, but he was alive. And so we can consider the information that comes from this, I think, fully credible about Peckham and his life and deeds. He was, at least at the beginning, the treasurer, Deacon Robert Peckham, of the Worcester North Anti-Slavery Society, 1836. We see some familiar names here. Here's Goodyear, Deacon Robert Peckham. We see last names that are familiar in Westminster, Everett, J.T. Everett. We see Wood, we see Jones. We see a lot of people that are prominent characters in Westminster. Here's one of them, George Kendall. He is at Forbes Memorial Library. His portrait, at least. So Peckham represented him here. He probably painted more members of his family. We don't have those. They might be out there, but we do have this one, and he appears in Judson Rich's list. Sympathy for the oppressed was very strong, and efforts were made to indoctrinate the people in the true gospel of freedom. Among the leaders were the Kendalls, Edward and George Kendall, the Merriams, Haywood, Peckham again, Miles, Wyman, Benjamin Wyman. He's the one that he reincorporated the school with. Again, pretty recurring. Now here is a petition against the gag rule. You may or may not be familiar with the gag rule. It was implemented from 1836 to 1844 to forbid a discussion in the House of Representatives of the idea of abolition itself. I mean, it was really outright censorship. John Quincy Adams fought very prominently against it. And after 8 years of fighting, he did eventually have it overturned. Really tremendous story. He was quite a character. I've actually become very fond of Quincy Adams after reading about him. We don't really hear much very specific about him, but he accomplished a lot. He was, I believe, the only former president to join the House of Representatives to continue this work with his life for the public good. And it's really quite extraordinary. And so Peckham was a pretty big fan, as you'll learn very soon. Westminster citizens, Cyrus Mann, Robert Peckham, 51 citizens of Westminster, submitted a petition against the gag rule to protest without delay in the name of the people. You can see they've got all these signatures. This is one of dozens of anti-slavery petitions that Peckham's signature appears on, alongside his portrait subjects. Interestingly, many of them appear as well. Not a huge surprise. So here are Peckham's own words on the gag rule. He says, to protect against free discussion. He calls out the capital itself, becoming a slave market where for the vilest party purposes, men are bought and sold in exchange for extra important votes. He has some very strong words about this. And this letter is directed to none other than John Quincy Adams. Now, returning to the gag rule, I briefly explained it. It's most of what I said here, but it's quite notable how much risk he took in this. He received death threats. He wrote in his diary about them. He took really an enormous risk here. Here he is in a political cartoon of the era, 1838 to 39. He kept fighting this. He tried more and more loopholes and tactics to speak about abolition, to have bills introduced. He just kept trying. He did not give up. It's a really tenacious spirit. And I think that was what Peckham admired so greatly. I'll read the letter because I believe this is actually the first time that this letter has been seen. I dug it up out of the Mass Historical Society records of John Quincy Adams, one of 3 letters that Peckham wrote to him. Westminster, Mass, December 25th, 1838. So he took the time off on Christmas to write to Quincy Adams, send his very justified fan mail. The undersigned have been appointed as a committee of the Anti-Slavery Society of this town to express to you their thanks for your noble efforts in Congress in behalf of the liberty of speech and of petition, and in behalf of oppressed humanity. Petition, that's the title of my presentation. He said that, those are his very own words, in his very own hand. The duty imposed upon us is at once very pleasing and very difficult. Pleasing because most consonant with our own hearts. Difficult because words are inadequate to express ourselves and those we represent. As citizens of the great republic, which at least lastly professes to guarantee to all within its limits freedom and protection, we thank you for your earnest and powerful endeavors to rescue these inborn rights from a most unhallowed desecration. We feel the more grateful when we reflect how few have had the courage to stand by you while the fierce wrath of slavery was vented upon your devoted head. Sir, you have had repeatedly to witness the passage of gag resolutions by the American Congress. Gag resolutions, for what? Why, to protect against free discussion. The patriarchal institution, the divine institution, sanctioned by all reason, common prudence, and revelation. While standing in your place in the hall of legislation and debate, to reiterate those very principles which brought into existence the Republic, and which are fundamental in every free government, you have heard from every part of the House the most disorderly cries for order, loud and shameless demands for the protection of Southern rights, as though the real free man, the slave, and the Union of the States were all the merest subsidiaries to the interest of the South. Northern representatives too. But, sir, it is quite needless that we should tell you of the voluntary slavery which your own eyes daily witness, for it would seem that the capital itself has become a slave market where, for the vilest party purposes, men are bought and sold, and where whole states are bargained away to Southern slavery in exchange for the extra important votes of slaveholders. But now such a bargain, if indeed it has been attempted, cannot be satisfied. The people are themselves and not things. Besides, we rejoice in the belief that there are men on the floor of Congress who will never cower. We rejoice to find one so talented and so learned as the one whom we are addressing, foremost of those who dare speak and act for humanity, and for health. Sir, your efforts are not vain. Perseverance will increase success. Even now, your reward is rich. You have awakened fresh gratitude in the hearts of millions, and conscience, that voice of the Most High, assures you. Blessed is he that considereth the poor. Robert Peckham, Caleb Brown, Joel Merriam. And in Quincy Adams' own hand, we see he had received it. So this was probably a very welcome departure for him from the hate mail he was getting to receive such a heartfelt and very well said letter from Peckham. And I think that he's, as mentioned, an exceptionally good writer. I think that he really sums up a lot of the feelings of the day about these atrocities that were happening and the way that there was suppression against these efforts to stop them, to bring the country onto a better path. This was something he felt very, very strongly about. He was very, very active in. Not the only cause. He also advocated for temperance, but abolition was really a big one. Here are a couple of other letters that he wrote. He mentions that he's sending him a new petition. This is in 1837, a year before. This was also about the gag rule. This is about the gag rule petition, interestingly. He sent him an extra letter just to be sure he got it. Very thorough. And here he sends another letter on behalf of the female petitioners of Westminster. He says, on behalf of the females of Westminster who have signed the enclosed petition, respectfully request you would present the same. Now, the females of Westminster does sound a little odd, but remember they had the Female Book Club of Westminster, so that was probably their own terminology. And so he wrote this on behalf of the ladies of Westminster, all the women. Interestingly, his own wife and daughter were involved in gathering petitions. There's proof of that. It was really interesting to find. Notably, abolition among women was gaining greater recognition at the time. There was imagery being published with a female version of the iconic "Am I not a man and a brother" image of a slave pleading for his freedom that was published alongside Whittier's anti-slavery poem, Our Countrymen in Chains. So little Whittier tidbit there. So here's the female version, Am I not a woman and a sister? So this was really gaining ground. Here is Ruth Peckham. She has petitions from 1838 to 1840. Here we see Ruth S. Peckham in 1840 and 39 others of Westminster, and Ruth Peckham and 172 others of Westminster. So clearly two different Ruth Peckhams, which surely are his wife and his daughter. Ruth S. Peckham is probably Ruth Sawyer Peckham, who was, this is a maiden name. So Massachusetts legislature, list of petitions presented. And then the other source that I found for an 1838 petition, the petition of Ruth Peckham and 139 women of Westminster, appears in a Georgia newspaper, which also takes great pains to add an editorial warning of how Southern people have not the most distant idea of the extent of the spirit of abolitionism and its unguarded and alarming attacks upon their constitutional rights. So, that was a kind of rhetoric that was being passed around in the Southern papers at the time, reassuring the Southern people the abolitionists were wrong, while also warning them that this belief in freedom was gaining provenance and, oh, goodness forbid. So, but there were enough petitions and enough momentum to really make some change. And the Peckhams, the whole Peckham family, not just Robert, were participating here. But unfortunately, Ruth Sawyer Peckham passed away in 1842. Her obituary is very touching. He probably wrote it. I will read it here in full. At Westminster, Mass, February 7th, Mrs. Ruth S., wife of Deacon Robert Peckham, aged 52 years. A consistent Christian in life, she enjoyed the Christian's peace in death. Her religion was neither periodical nor ostentatious, but with a consciousness of her own demerits. Her unwavering trust was alone in her Redeemer. Be it that she moved mainly within the narrow sphere of her family, her influence there was all the greater for that. All her instructions were enforced by the sincerest, most ardent love, sanctified by the purest Christian principle. For her children, whether in infancy or in maturer years, at home or abroad, her prayers were daily offered. They seemed as a part of her own being. She loved them and labored for them, not simply because they were her children, but because their souls were in a sense entrusted to her care. But she has gone. Blessed is her memory. Our joy in our bereavement is that she is beyond the reach of sorrow, May her prayers be realized, and we all meet her in heaven. So really beautiful obituary, very, very sad. He was very much grieving his wife. And this is probably why he resigned a couple of months later as deacon from his church. It has been speculated that his resignation had to do with the abolition issue. That doesn't appear to be the case, actually. He did split with the church because of this, but his resignation from the deaconship itself appears to be so that he would care for his family. His children were Ruth, age 17, George, age 15, Samuel Henry, aged 9. Samuel Henry was sadly a particularly troubled child, so Peckham probably felt a particular familial duty to look after his son. Interestingly, in the church notes gathered by Anne Howard, it says, when Deacon Robert Peckham resigned after 14 years of service in May of 1842, a committee of 8 was formed to find 2 replacements. So clearly he was doing some pretty heavy lifting over there, but he had to resign and to care for his family, probably. I think it's a very logical conclusion, considering that he seems to have been very affected by the passing of his wife, and he had his children. Here's Samuel Henry, cute little guy with a slate here. Unfortunately, he ran away from home a couple of times. And there are notices in the paper about this at 16 and again at 19, which mentions some issues with his mental health. But Peckham really loved for him. He really cared for him. He appears in his household census at age 22 and again at age 27 in 1855 and 1860. As a painter, as a young man who was doing quite well for himself, here he is as an adult. Rare to have portraits of the same child and then a grown man from his own family. It's a really nice comparative example of Peckham's later style, the evolution of it, the precision in which he painted. But it is the same Samuel Henry. Tragically, most tragically of all, he died at Andersonville. He contracted exposure. It was disease contracted by exposure, lack of food, as Haywood writes in History of Westminster. He died much too young. Peckham grieved him greatly. Peckham wrote a very long and very eloquent historical poem for the dedication of the Civil War Memorial Monument in Westminster, on which Samuel H. Peckham's name appears. Aged 31 years, he died. So it's just incredibly tragic. And I'm sure that Peckham had an immense amount of grief about it, but he stayed productive, he stayed motivated, he wrote and published this poem, quite possibly the same poem that David Crashes knew the existence of and mentioned, and it's really nice to be able to reveal it and to shed some light on how talented and eloquent he was. Now here's just a little bit more documentation about abolitionist lecturers becoming an issue in 1946. Brother George Miles appears to have been excommunicated simply for speaking out about the church, shutting out anti-slavery lectures. Not particularly great. Speaking of lecturers in Westminster, here is the whole bunch of them. We have William Lloyd Garrison, Abby Kelly, the Mrs. Grimke of South Carolina, Sally Holly, Henry B. Stanton, Mr. Dresser, Mr. Torrey. There's a little brief look at them. Garrison. Peckham knew Garrison. They were on the same anti-slavery committee, including a committee where they formed groups to avoid kidnapping, to fight against kidnapping of escaped slaves in their county. Here's the masthead of the Liberator that Garrison was the massively successful editor of. You see on the left, there's a scene of suffering and grief and tragedy. On the right, the utopia, hopeful scene of emancipation. It reminded me a little bit of Peckham's illustrations to do with temperance, which are very similar, the suffering from alcoholism and the happiness of abstaining from alcohol and, going out with your family on a nice day. So I thought it was an interesting to have that little comparative format. We don't know who illustrated for Garrison. I would love to know someday. It's really interesting stuff. More illustrations. There's Abby Kelly Foster, the Grimkes, Sally Holly, Henry B. Stanton, Amos Dresser, Stanton and Dresser in Westminster, Torrey, and the Underground Railroad. Now I know we're running a little long on time here, so we may end up going a little bit longer. Kaylee, is that going to be all right if we go a little bit longer? All right, thank you. So, returning again to the trusty 125th. Peckham and the Underground Railroad. Deacon Peckham has several times sheltered under his roof and fed from his table, and in other ways helped onward toward Canada, the fleeing slave. At one time, a Quaker, late one Saturday night, brought to his house a slave mother and child. The mother, on being uncovered, was found to be white, and the child only slightly tinged with color. She was delighted with her reception and told the story of her escape. Collecting $7 for her, their benefactor, notably Peckham, that was Peckham, directed the Quaker where to go in Gardiner the next night, Sunday, and with fugitives all covered up in the carriage, on to freedom they wended their way in sweet and glorious triumph. Thank God, this is now the land of true freedom. And so that wonderful little anecdote actually is backed up by multiple historical sources. We know a great deal more about the woman, thanks to a letter from Edward Kendall. It appears in American Antiquarian Society Journal of Anti-Slavery Activities, discussing a young woman about 30 years old and almost white. She was given dinner and clothing and went on her way. Here's a little child, probably not too dissimilar from the child she brought with her, painted by another Massachusetts painter, William Pryor. This is Deacon Joshua T. Everett. Notably, he appeared in many of those sources that I cited further back about the anti-slavery groups. Again, consistent recurring names. He points out she was very light-skinned and she was about 30 and she had a little child. They gave her dinner and help and on she went to Canada. So it was all matching up. Now, here, from the letter from Edward Kendall Jr., March 1838, we have the actual account from her. He wrote it down as she said it. So here's a representation of what she might have looked like. We obviously don't know actually who this is. From the Shores and Smiles collection, lovely little miniature. A Westminster, Massachusetts man, Edward Kendall Jr., wrote to Megan Amos Phelps, described a slave, a female with a young child. He recounted her history as given by herself. Now, the scholar who wrote this little blurb points out the importance of firsthand accounts, and I agree. So here is the actual letter. I did transcribe this. I'll read that one a little bit. There passed through this place some 3 weeks since a slave, a female with a young child, going to use her own language to a land of freedom. Her history is this: her first master was her father. And he points out that she could pass as white, as is mentioned in the other accounts. She lived in Virginia. He willed her freedom after his death. She was reclaimed by her mistress being remarried. She lost a suit. She got her freedom actually at first time attempt. She was helped. She was reclaimed. She came to Philadelphia. She married. She lived 3 years with her husband. Then she lost this lawsuit. So she went through repeatedly the cycle of being freed and helped and escaping and being dragged back into slavery, which is horrific to think about. She had 2 children. She was brought back to Virginia by an officer, but when he was taken sick, there was a delay, and in that time, she was assisted in escaping. One of the domestics came into her room. They told her the family had sat down. She threw her bonnet and cloak out of a broken pane of glass in her room. She ran a mile. She'd gone 3 or 4 miles. She inquired for a place called Quaker Hill. Again, the Quakers. This matches up to the account of the people Peckham helped. She found her friends, went to Philadelphia and on to New York. She was in company with her pursuers on her passage. You can't even imagine how terrifying that must have been. She brought her child along in a bag, her little child. She left her older child with the Quakers for safety's sake. So it says, she, in company with a gentleman of the denomination of Quaker, to a land of liberty. It's interesting, the overlap in the description between this and the account in the 125th of the escaping former slaves that Peckham helped and who did get their freedoms. Really quite remarkable. She appeared to be 30 years of age. She expected to meet her husband on arriving at her place of destination. So she might have gotten a happy ending after all. We can only hope so. Here are some portraits after the war of little babies, young women. We don't have a portrait of her. It seems unlikely Peckham would have painted her, probably for her own safety. Obviously, you wouldn't want a record that she was there. Now some remarks by Frederick Douglass in portrait painting. He didn't think very favorably of it. Here he is. There was a painting done from an engraving, but he didn't sit for a portrait that we know of. I wish he did, because he is linked to Peckham. Here's the wrong illustration. It's not very good. Peckham's obituaries all cite Frederick Douglass. They seem to have been embellished a little bit. One of them says his house sheltered Frederick Douglass for a week when he was making his way to Canada, and many of his brethren likewise found aid and comfort when fleeing for liberty. This one says he aided several slaves and sheltered Douglass as he was flitting about the country to keep out of harm's way. But we do know Frederick Douglass spoke in Westminster, 1844, 1845, and 1849. So Peckham really kept him coming back. So he was definitely a very, very prominent speaker to have been able to invite. So did a good job there. Here's a couple others that he came along with: Charles Lennox Remond, Parker Pillsbury. Extraordinarily long list going on here, but there is one more. Peckham had an anti-slavery picnic, July 4th, 1843. He advertised for it, as did his friend Benjamin Wyman, same one again. He placed an ad in the newspaper. He said, prominent anti-slavery speakers from abroad are expected to be present. He didn't quite get that. Here's an anti-slavery picnic, not his, but a local Massachusetts town. There he is, Aidan Ballou. He wrote The Voice of Duty, which got rave reviews in the Liberator. This was an address, a very long one, that he delivered. It's very, very eloquent and very fiery. It got obviously quite popular. Oops, that's my alarm for this lecture. That's just, here it is. He says, we are here to do all this, to invigorate the love of freedom and to deepen the detestation of tyranny, without respect of persons, without favor, and without fear. Man is man wherever he may exist. It's very strong stuff. He says, it is usual for our 4th of July orators to glorify liberty, the birthright of American white men. And he goes on to point out that they are overlooking men of color and slavery. They're denouncing the British while ignoring the American troubles that still plagued society. He's, quite right. It's very sobering stuff, and to have at a picnic too. But so Peckham was definitely making a strong stance with that. He goes on to say, it is a pitiful weakness to crave perpetual flattery and to be offended at wholesome reproof. We Americans have exhibited full enough of this weakness. We have been children long enough. We have been wheedled and befooled long enough by the sops and sugar plums of demagogues. Politicians thrive by trimming to the whims and caprices of the people, by managing them. True philanthropists and patriots, by reforming the public sentiment, by bringing the people to identify their honor and prosperity with righteousness, by learning them to govern themselves. And it all goes on for another 10 plus pages this way. It's definitely a good read, but obviously a bit too long, so I'll skip forward here. Sadly, Peckham didn't get very many people to picnic compared to the 3,000 people at another anti-slavery picnic closer to Boston. Same day, probably same time. Garrison went to that one, so Peckham probably didn't stand much of a chance. But he did have this published in the Liberator eventually, and Ballou got to put it in print, 1843, and it has definitely stood the test of time. He was involved with the Liberty Party, a third party that felt the two parties had become complicit and not effective in combating slavery. But all of this got him in some trouble. He was excommunicated in 1848, and Howard's notes give some clarity on that. He stood up for himself with multiple letters, most of which are very strong. He had been condemned by them, supposedly for mishandling documents related to the church and the academy being separated. It was all wholly spurious, frankly. So he has some strong comments here. And he asks for a council to review the decision from other churches, other locales. They did have the council, and they found he had done nothing wrong. The council do not learn that anything prejudicial to the character of Deacon Peckham was even known of him during the 26 years of his membership. So he really didn't do anything wrong here. And it was blamed on certain local matters of a secular nature. Unsurprising. Now, concluding here with Peckham's Civil War poem, which is one of my favorite pieces of this. It's very long again, but it is very good. It's all done in verse, not dissimilar to Whittier's poetry, actually. I think it's very fair to say he might have taken inspiration from Whittier for this, because he was a fan of Whittier's work, even way back when in 1833. So he was probably very glad to have an opportunity to publish something like that. And it's pretty good. He starts out comparing a foe in our midst to destroy our fair hope, which is freedom after the British, escaping the British, which proved more tyrannic than the hard British yoke. This foe like a serpent coiled around the state, and instead of freedom brought malice and hate. And so this snake imagery was not uncommon in political cartoons. You can see there a Union general fighting off the multi-headed serpent of secession and slavery. Some excellent little political cartoons that I think are timeless. The bird, the national bird, and thriving at the beginning, and then starved and suffering. And the ballot box being kicked around. His stuff doesn't go away, but Peckham had some strong thoughts about it. The prisoners of war, the part is particularly devastating. In Westminster, all hearts beat for the right, and our brave boys started quick for the fight. They had a desire to give their best aid, and to meet the foe they were never afraid. Yet many of our boys have lost their life in facing this wicked, rebellious strife. But there was a class whose deplorable state fills me with grief their cause to relate. These were the prisoners taken in battle and put into pens like herds of cattle. They are without shelter from a burning sun, whose scorching rays they could not shun. It goes on, and it gets worse and worse. And his son passed this way, suffering horribly. And he says, amongst the names upon this stone is one who died there, the writer's son. His name with others can now be read as one amongst the starved dead. With pain and grief, I must relate it, but as a specimen, I would state it. For the great number who died there did, like my son, starvation share. He also includes a warning about the current circumstances about Andrew Johnson. He has many pages of praise for Abraham Lincoln, rightly so, but calls attention to Johnson mishandling and squandering the opportunity. He said, Johnson now felt that he was a power, which did make Congress and others to cower. Now he could go on with his tyrannic sway and rule o'er the country in his own way. For Congress had shown such fear of his station, lest impeachment should embroil the nation. So on and so forth. He was trying to build up his own elevation. He has found sycophants in cabinet places who are ready to aid and work in his traces. So Peckham felt it was not all solved by the Civil War. These problems were still ongoing. There's a cartoon by Thomas Nast, who you may have heard of. He was quite prolific, quite skilled. He did a cartoon of Johnson disposing of the Freedmen's Bureau as African Americans go flying. Johnson felt essentially they were receiving too much help, and Peckham did not agree with that. But he has some strong thoughts at the end. It has been told that $1 million of money has been offered for votes as a stimulant bounty. Some may give heed till it swells in their eyes. Their consciences stretch, and they grasp at the prize. But let it be noted, if such ones there be, that those much thus made rich can't from treachership flee. Their country's decision, as Arnold's of old, will stamp them as traitors to be bought and sold. And so he still believed, even with the turmoil of the present day in 1868, that this would resolve itself, that the country would continue to get better and to heal after this catastrophic Civil War. Hang on, why didn't that load? Show anyway. There we go. Oh, so the end of his Civil War poem, those names upon it tell us their end, how each has sacrificed some dearest friend. They left us in health no more to return, whilst we their absence are left to mourn. May we not hope they've gone to their rest in the regions of light amongst the blessed. They shall there be free from sorrow and pain. Let us all prepare to meet them again. Now, if you recall, this wording is quite similar to his obituary for his wife. So recurring sentiment throughout the years, as he lost his family, he saw these catastrophes playing out around him, and he still did everything he could to help Westminster, to help his community, to really take a stand, to be a role model, I think, for not only his family, but for the citizens around him. And frankly, I think that even if he had never painted a single painting, he would have been historically notable. He would have been worth remembering. But he did paint all of these lovely paintings. Here's another finding that maybe a young man of the Peckham family. He certainly looks the part. He's just, nice little young man. One of many Peckhams that have been scattered around New England, but they're just waiting to be discovered. And I think that he himself has been waiting to be discovered. He was a humble person. He did not promote himself to access or really at all. He promoted the causes he stood for, but he was not concerned with ego or notoriety. He barely signed his paintings. He just wanted to represent the world around him with his paintbrush and to improve it wherever he could. And so he says, in a little piece of advice at the very end, let young men who would wish to rise have a good standard before their eyes. In whatever business be your aim, don't set your hearts on future fame. Seek to do right, all things thorough, then true fame will be sure to follow. And it certainly seems that he followed his own advice. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Emily. That was fantastic.
Thank
You
you.
are such a wealth of knowledge. Does
Thank you so
anybody
much.
have any questions that they would like to ask?
I'd love some questions. Go
Feel
ahead.
free to unmute and you can ask away.
I don't have any questions, but your presentation was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Oh, I
no,
really appreciate that.
no, it
I'm
was
so
very
glad.
great.
Thank you. I am so glad you were able to come.
Yeah.
Really an honor to present. I'm so flattered. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, Mary in the chat says, Mary Chomo says, great program, very well researched. Thank you, Mary. Thank you. I'm so glad you could all come. I sent out a lot of individual invites, so it means a lot to me for each and every one of you to come to this. And if you have any questions about any of the material, any of the slides I had to skip, go ahead.
Mm.
Come on.
Are there any other questions or comments? Oh,
Hi,
Linda
Emily,
says
this is
thank you.
Betsy.
Hi,
How are you? This was
I'm
one.
good. Oh, I'm so glad.
Are we able to access this presentation that we can read the sections that you have?
Yes,
We
yes, I will be making the
so
presentation.
It went
Yes,
so fast we couldn't catch up
I
with.
know, I'm sorry. I had to condense this into an hour. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
We've
wow.
also recorded tonight, so we will get this video up on our YouTube page and it will be available. I hope to get it up tomorrow, but I'll definitely get it up by next week.
Great.
Great.
And in the chat, Linda Cotulis says, thank you so much. And Tattersall says, thanks, very interesting on many topics. Marianne Zephyr says, hey, Marianne. Thank you, Emily. This was wonderful and congratulations on your article in Antiques Digest. I look forward to reading it. Thank you so much, Marianne. Thank you to all of you. Of
Yeah,
course.
Emily,
Hello.
Lou and Anita Schwartz from Florida and Michigan.
Oh, hi. How
And
are
we
you?
checked in and listened to the lecture. It was very interesting.
Oh, I'm so glad you enjoyed. I'm so glad you could make it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, if there are no other questions, I'm gonna stop recording, but I'm not ending the session if we want to continue
Roland says,
chatting.
Roland Oxenbine. Hi, Roland. Says, thank you. Great presentation, worthwhile. Glad to hear from you. Thank you for when I visited. Thank you for all the info and help. I appreciate that. Thank you to that Marianne as well, the Peckham House. I learned a lot from my visit, and thank you all to all of you, Nick Langhart, Betsy, everybody